Hello and welcome to episode 28 of my Kerbal Space Program NASA series. Picking up where we left off from the last video, after delivering the truss extensions to the International Space Station, the shuttle is preparing to return home. Gonna show a little more of the landing than I typically do, just because I purposefully used an older shuttle design. In fact, this is pretty much my original shuttle design. You see it doesn't have those extra control surfaces at the wingtips, and nor does it have the water purifiers on the OMS pods. And mainly because I wasn't quite convinced that my landing issues were with the shuttle. I was pretty certain they were with me trying to land it and my technique. I was watching some of my previous videos and I've noticed I've gotten into a bad habit of coming in much more steeply, coming in from a high altitude, braking on the way down, and really making a pretty reckless kind of crash landing. So this time I resolved myself to come in a little shallower, which the fear in coming in shallow is that I'll run out of energy before I get to the runway. But the problem I've been having lately is I've just got way too much speed coming in for a landing. And the dynamics of the space shuttle landing are that as I try to arrest my horizontal or my vertical speed, I have to pitch nose up. That causes horizontal speed to bleed off, which in turn causes horizontal or vertical speed to increase rapidly as a result. So it's kind of trying to walk this fine line between pitching up too much too early and just really nailing the balance. But you can already see coming in a lot more shallow than I have been lately. It's a lot more leisurely approach. But as you can see, even with the nose down at say 17-18 degrees, I'm not really losing a lot of speed very quickly. So I just needed to have a little more confidence in the space shuttle and in my ability to land it. 280 meters a second, that's a very fast approach. More than enough energy to make it to the runway. In fact, I've got to bleed off a little bit before I get there. Coming in a lot more shallow with a lower glide slope is a lot more convenient and it's a lot easier to handle on the way in. And in fact, this ends up being one of my better landings. Still touchdown a little hard, there's a little bit of a bounce there, but had a touchdown speed of about 160 meters a second, which isn't too bad. Deploy the braking parachute and get it stopped before it rolls off the end. I normally engage the brakes right after the parachute pops, but I was a little curious to see how much it would actually slow down the shuttle right after deployment, and it's about 150 meters a second bled off before we get to the end. Gets it down to a nice leisurely 20 meters a second before we can turn the brakes on. And keeping the vertical speed low also prevents the braking parachute and those rear maneuvering pods from getting knocked off. And this actually happened by accident. You'll notice this is my intermediate shuttle design. It's got the extra control surfaces, but it does not have the water purifiers on the OMS pods to improve the glide ratio. This was completely by mistake. I wasn't getting cocky. I just wasn't paying attention to which variant of the Space Shuttle Avalon I was grabbing. But enough about the shuttle. This mission is finally deploying the solar arrays, the main solar arrays, to the International Space Station. And you notice my rendezvous times are a lot shorter. It's not 4 or even 7 days to rendezvous, it's 2 days. These last two launches I've waited till the space station was directly over KSP before launching. I can probably wait till it's a little bit further east to make a better rendezvous. But either way, this is much better than what I had been running. Because the more supplies that are on board the shuttle, the more I can deliver to the station to keep it topped up without having to fly dedicated support and resupply missions. Interestingly enough, I wasn't prepared for what a difference tweak scale can make in the cost of modules. I wasn't paying attention until I actually got back and saw how much money I had left. This whole launch cost about 400,000 funds, because each one of those Gigantor solar panels, when you increase the scale, the price increase is ridiculous. And through kind of experimentation, I found out that the tweak scale algorithm for determining price is kind of linear. And I mean that it'll actually set a price as negative. If you take the orbital achievement engine from the KW rocketry pack and reduce it in size, it actually goes below 0 and you get NaN, not a number, as your price. That was something I've discovered in trying to design a couple probes, which was rather interesting. And still wasn't able to deploy this thing without putting some spin into it, but as the probe has ably demonstrated, it is definitely agile enough to catch a spinning payload. And this is actually kind of a long deployment because there's a couple different things that I'm accomplishing on this flight. First off, I'm getting the primary solar arrays installed. Secondly, I'm getting the P0 truss, which is that part sticking off down off the lower right of the station with the other Gigantor arrays. I had originally misinterpreted what I was looking at on the schematics of the space station throughout its different stages of development. I always assumed that that part, the P0, was one of the end trusses and it was moved later in construction. That is actually in the completely wrong place, and it is a completely separate part. So while we're up here, we're going to reposition it to the correct location. Finally managed to deploy something without putting a lot of spin into it, or any for that matter. Still don't want the shuttle drifting too far away because I am going to dock back with the station. And send the probe to motor over and pick up the other truss piece. I've applied tweak scale to make the Gigantor solar arrays bigger. I've also increased the size of that modular girder piece. You'll notice that because it fits the truss adapter perfectly. It's about 1.25 meters in diameter at this stage. And that kind of, to save on RAM, I'm really playing with the idea of on my next playthrough, because it is going to be relegated to 32-bit. I'm really thinking about using procedural fuel tanks and just deleting all the tanks out of all the various mods I've used. Near future, I probably will have to keep those because it has some specialized fuel tanks. And that quick save and quick load came about because if you notice there was an OX stat solar panel hanging out off that docking port, just hanging off in space doing nothing. And before I brought this in, I really thought I should see if I could get that bug to fix itself before we try to put something there. I was afraid that when the colliders recompiled, we'd have unplanned rapid disassembly, as they say. Thankfully, F5, F9 cured that. And it's just a matter of getting this thing delivered. I really like the accuracy in rotation that I'm able to get out of this probe when I deliver things. So, contrary to what I was saying before, I think I'm just going to leave it up there. If worse comes to worse, I can always just deorbit the thing on its own, but it's a pretty useful little piece of tech, so might as well leave it up here until I'm certain it's no longer useful. Getting very close to finishing out this station, and one of the things that made this video a little slow coming out is I've been stalking Amazon every day when I'm not doing homework, and as you may have remembered from another video of mine, if you watched, I have pre-ordered the collector's edition of Homeworld Remastered. My wife actually pre-ordered that back in, I think, March of last year, like within days of it being available. And today is Monday the 3rd, or the 2nd, geez. And we just now got a shipping confirmation for whatever reason. So I've been wasting way more time than I should have waiting for that to come in and trying to scratch my Homeworld itch by playing the original. Finally, I beat Homeworld 1. I'm not going to show the playthrough of that one. I didn't record any of it. That was just for me. But it did give me an idea for my Homeworld playthrough. I originally got the strategy guide with the Game of the Year edition of Homeworld. So I've pretty much used the strategies in it ever since forever, and I've pretty much committed them to memory. However, I've noticed by the end of by the final mission, I had 4 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, 3 missile destroyers, and I honestly lost count of my frigates from abuse of the capture mechanic. And by the end of the fight, I had maybe 8 actual Kushan ships in the fleet, and the rest were a mix of the Kadeshi multi-beam frigates, even had Tyrannic Raider multi-beam ion frigates, or ion array frigates, and other assorted weirdness. And the game has dynamic difficulty, so having such a huge fleet, it massively inflated the enemy numbers. So, and because maneuverability, it's very difficult to get all of your ships in position to fire at the same time. And I was noticing that I had these massive, really impressive arrays, just walls of firepower. But because they had to wait until they were in their own correct position to actually fire, most of the fleet was not deploying its weapons. So my plan for the Homeworld playthrough is I'm still going to use the capture mechanic, but any ship that is not something I build is going to be retired for resource units, so I can build a pure 100% Kushan fleet. So we'll see how that works out. It didn't actually make the game, even the inflated enemy numbers didn't exactly make the game more difficult, because I had the firepower and I could soak up the losses. But it generally made things a lot weirder and a lot more tedious than they should have been. So I'm going to try something new for my next playthrough. If you watched a couple of my Homeworld videos, you could see I was well on my way to abusing the capture mechanic. Finally going to get this put where it should be, according to the latest blueprint of the ISS I've been looking at. And once that's in, going to finally get the solar arrays fully deployed, and this thing is going to look like the International Space Station for the first time. Still got quite a few more modules to install, but this has really been the big one as far as aesthetics go. And as far as scale goes, it's not going to be actually to scale. The truss should be quite a bit longer for it to be correctly scaled, but flying up extra truss extensions was really just going to be pointless, and I decided that I would just kind of shrink things down a bit. It fits more with Kerbal proportions, things being a little bit smaller and stubbier. Although, not to look at the way I build things, because pretty much everything I've been building lately has been a one-to-one NASA recreation. Probably going to follow a similar aesthetic in my next playthrough. Things are probably going to look more high-tech and serious, not quite so cartoony. I'm actually really bad at designing properly Kerbal cartoony ships. I've maybe flown a single asparagus stage rocket in my entire KSP career, for whatever reason. And I could have actually made those solar arrays a little bit bigger in tweak scale, but there was no way they were going to fit inside the shuttle payload bay at the same time. I'm going to reposition the shuttle by rotating 180 degrees before redocking. But I think that's a pretty decent scale for the Gigantors. I really, really have to give props, I guess, to tweak scale. I highly recommend it, because if I wanted to get correctly sized solar arrays, I probably would have had to download an entirely different mod and up my part count. And if you're struggling to stay within your RAM limits and keep your part counts down, tweak scale can give you a lot of flexibility that you otherwise wouldn't have. So instead of having to download like the Cosmos pack or one of the station parts packs, which I can't remember the proper name of it, but the mod that has the actual ISS inspired shuttle or station parts is probably one of the better looking ones I've ever seen, and I would like to include it in my next playthrough. But like I said, it's going to be in 32-bit, and in testing I'm running, after about 3 hours I can get a RAM crash on Reentry, but on the plus side, Final Frontier is a lot more stable, and so I can actually keep track of my Kerbonauts' individual merits. But trying to keep my RAM limit down is going to be the big challenge for the next one. Nice vanity shot of the space station in its current configuration. Basically, I have to add, I believe, 5 or 6 more modules and dock 2 Soyuz craft to it. And then I think KSS is going to be complete. Probably going to have that finished within the next 2 or 3 videos. I've actually got most of the next video put together, and that does include my Pathfinder-style Mars landing, or Duna landing. So that's actually pretty exciting. That was everything went well, if anyone's wondering. I was actually surprised everything deployed quite nicely. But yeah, even this is the most suboptimal space shuttle design I have, because the control surfaces move the center of mass further back, and I don't have any ballast to compensate. But still was able to manage a pretty decent landing with it. A little bumpy and just about smacked into the runway, actually, but still got it down safely. And I forgot, one of the downsides of having those aircraft parked on the tarmac next to the runway is it tends to freeze the game while it waits for that to load. Hasn't caused any crashes, like game crashes, but it's a little disconcerting to have it pause for 2 or 3 seconds. Finally get the space shuttle stopped from yet another successful mission. And because that one was so expensive, I started looking through contracts, and I found a communication satellite deployment contract for about 300,000 funds. It required me to put it into a polar orbit, and since I haven't really put much into polar orbits and really discussed the finer points of hitting the fine print orbital specific orbit contracts, thought I would go into a little more detail with this launch. Just kind of a Delta looking single stage booster. I learned my lesson from some of my previous launches, and I've started to put the transfer stages for my satellites actually inside the fairings. But the trick was to mainly wait for the KSC to be almost directly underneath this polar orbit. I still had to burn a little bit laterally to actually meet the required inclination, but it wasn't too much of a big deal. And because I overshot my altitude, turning broadside into the airstream, what little airstream is left at 57 kilometers, you can see it's actually bringing my apoaps down quite slowly, but it's still coming down. Once I fire up the engine, I can start correcting my inclination, which takes a lot of watching in the map view. And you see it's starting to slowly move that back into plane. And I am by no means an astrodynamics expert, so for me, hitting one of these takes quite a bit of fiddling, and basically the best advice I can give you for one of these is massively overbuild your ship, but if you don't launch into the plane of your orbit for one of these polar orbits, even massively overbuilding isn't going to do you much good. Fortunately, I forgot to deploy my long-range antenna. On the plus side, I've got enough communications hardware in orbit that I got close enough to another one for that dipole antenna to make a connection. And that is, once again, the KR7X modded antenna that I made by copying and hacking through some config files. But by putting the transfer and adjustment stage attached to the satellite inside the fairing, it really prevents any potential clipping issues with those solar panels. Just keep trying to burn laterally. This would be in the normal orientation using enhanced nav vol. But if you're playing in the current version of KSP, you already have this, so it's part of the stock game. So it's a lot easier to correct inclination than it used to be in the old days. And I wasn't too far off, but it still takes a little more delta V than I would like to get my apoaps lined up directly. What you're trying to do is to get your apoaps and periaps perfectly aligned to the plane of the orbit. That way, once you reach those, you can do another inclination adjustment and really have a easier time trying to get this thing perfectly correct. Demonstrating how to set up the maneuver node. And I'm not going to fix the apoaps just yet, because trying to bring the apoaps down at this stage would actually increase the eccentricity of the orbit. And as you can kind of see when I look at this thing side on, it's already a fairly eccentric orbit. It's not perfectly circular. I mean, it's perfectly circular, but the barycenter, the center of the orbit, is a little shifted off of the center of the planet. And from this stage, it's actually pretty easy to just start lining things up and try to get this orbit set up correctly. That's still about 500 meters a second delta V to correct that, but that also includes bringing periaps up from out of the atmosphere. Trying to do as much of this maneuvering in single burns as I can. But and just in case we go too far out of the omnidirectional antenna range, going to point the dish at the long-range communications relay. And in case we do still lose it, because Kerbin obstructs us, I decided to use flight computer. I've finally made my peace with the flight computer. I'm only going to use it if the chance exists that I will lose remote tech contact with my network. Because otherwise, it's, as I've said before, it's basically just MechJeb, where you create the nodes yourself. And I learned a lot with MechJeb. I am not down on anybody who uses it at all. In fact, if that's how you gotta play this game to enjoy it, then you do it to your heart's content. But for me, I feel like I should be flying these a little more manually than I do. So I'm going to try to minimize flight computer usage. You see, even then, still got to make a little bit of adjustment. At this stage, it's time to correct for radial orientation. Went a little too far there. Going to back that back up. That looks pretty good. Go ahead and fire this up. I was actually concerned about that omnidirectional, mainly because it looks cool and it looks up a lot better than the oh gosh, the Communitron 32, but it actually has shorter range, even though I believe it actually costs and weighs more. And with that, finally meet the orbital parameters. And since it automatically shuts itself off, I just gotta not touch anything for 10 seconds to finally complete the contract. So stay tuned, thank you for watching, and doing a Pathfinder on the next video.